I was addressing things as the supervisor. There will be no comments, there will be anything. It would be me addressing you guys, telling you what's going on in the township.
Our CBA, that's our collective bargaining agreement, that's our union contract. So it comes with the C. That's what people are not saying.
Once seen as an unstoppable political force in Dalton, Tiffany Henyard now faces growing betrayal from those who once supported her, including her own spouse. The financial wrongdoing and abuse of power she is now at the center of has sparked an expanding investigation, and her once loyal inner circle is crumbling. Her name is in the news, but not for the reasons she had hoped. To fully understand her downfall, it's crucial to look back at how she rose to power, an ascent marked not just by ambition, but also by a carefully crafted image of invulnerability. However, as the investigation into her shady dealings intensifies, the facade she built over the years is beginning to collapse. The federal government is reportedly conducting an extensive probe into Tiffany's affairs, and former allies who once trusted her are now working with law enforcement to ensure justice is served. The attention surrounding her actions is growing with each passing day, and she can no longer escape the consequences of her deceit during her time in office. Tiffany surrounded herself with loyal supporters, people who appeared to be fiercely loyal. However, many of these individuals had questionable backgrounds of their own, creating a complex web of enablers and scapegoats. Tiffany had carefully constructed this network, assuming that, if any illegal activity came to light, her loyalists would take the fall for her. She thought she could avoid accountability by relying on them. But as the investigation gained momentum, her network began to unravel. One by one, her supposed protectors started turning against her, and the barriers she had carefully constructed began to crumble. The most shocking betrayal came from her own partner, Kamal Woods. Once seen as a staunch ally and friend, Kamal's cooperation with investigators suggests that his involvement in Tiffany's alleged schemes was far more complicated than anyone had initially realized. Kamal was not only Tiffany's longtime boyfriend, but also the director of her cancer foundation, which played a significant role in her public image. His involvement in her business operations made him a key figure in the investigation. Authorities are now looking into whether the foundation, purportedly set up to aid breast cancer patients, was a legitimate charity or simply a publicity stunt. The foundation's launch had raised eyebrows when it received a large donation, further fueling suspicions about its true purpose. As investigators delved into its financial records, they began to believe the organization was being used as a front for less altruistic activities. Tiffany's position, once seen as untouchable, was now in jeopardy, and she found herself in a precarious position with nowhere to turn. The breakdown of her support system only added to her mounting problems. Not only were her allies turning against her, but federal authorities were also uncovering new layers of wrongdoing. Reports suggest that Tiffany had used public funds, including money meant for Dalton's residents, to finance personal trips under the guise of promoting her foundation. These trips, allegedly paid for by taxpayer dollars, were part of Tiffany's attempt to further her personal agenda while disregarding the needs of the community she was meant to serve. This flagrant misuse of public funds raised alarms among investigators, prompting further scrutiny of her financial activities. The investigation took a significant turn when Kamal Wood's name appeared in subpoenas, signaling that the authorities were expanding their probe beyond Tiffany and into the financial activities of her inner circle. It was revealed that Kamal had been receiving a paycheck from Tiffany's questionable foundation. Additionally, he had recently landed a lucrative job in Thornton Township, earning a salary of over $100,000, an amount that most residents of Dalton could only dream of. The connection between Kamal's financial gains and Tiffany's activities is now a focal point of the investigation. Meanwhile, Tiffany's financial empire, built on deceit and manipulation, is being torn apart. Among the many businesses under her control was a restaurant and a property management company, both of which raised serious questions about her business practices. One particular case has stood out in the investigation, an incident in 2019 where a tenant lost their home due to hazardous living conditions, including mold and leaking buildings. This case exemplifies Tiffany's disregard for the well-being of Dalton's residents, as she had used her position for personal gain at the expense of those she was supposed to serve. What is most shocking, however, is the extent to which Tiffany's closest allies are now cooperating with authorities. The very people who had once shielded her from scrutiny are now assisting in the investigation, providing key information that could be the final nail in the coffin for her political career. The most devastating blow came from her own baby daddy, who had once been seen as a trustworthy figure in her life. His willingness to cooperate with law enforcement could prove to be the tipping point that finally destroys the facade Tiffany had so carefully built. As the investigation heats up, a damning portrait of Tiffany's actions is emerging. Her long-standing habit of taking shortcuts, abusing her authority, and prioritizing personal gain over public service is becoming clear. The story of Tiffany Henyard serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of corruption and unchecked ambition. Even those who believe they are untouchable can be brought down by the very people they once trusted. What began as a rapid rise to power is now degenerating into a dramatic and dishonorable fall from grace. The supporters who once helped her stay in power are now deserting her, ensuring that law enforcement has everything they need to hold her accountable. With each new revelation, Tiffany's fate seems more predetermined. As the walls close and around her supporters, once loyal, are now lining up to testify against her. With federal investigators closing in and her inner circle unraveling, Tiffany's reign at the seat appears to be coming to a sudden and inevitable end. The investigation is far from over, and as more secrets are uncovered, it is clear that Tiffany will have to face the consequences of her actions. Her story is a reminder of the perils of power, corruption, and greed. As Tiffany Henyard's empire crumbles, the question is no longer whether she will be held accountable, but when. With each passing day, the walls close in and the dissolution of her political empire appears to be imminent. Her once loyal allies are now working to bring her down, ensuring that justice will be served and that the damage she has caused will not go unpunished. Tiffany's fate is now sealed, and the coming chapters of her story will be a stark reminder of how quickly power can slip away and how those who once supported you can turn against you in the blink of an eye.
Damage, and then it leaked one into my kitchen, and the window sill leaked in my daughter's room.
Except they weren't. Enter activist David Lowry, who called Dalton directly. Suddenly, the house deemed livable on September 3rd became unfit for occupancy on October 15th. Lowry's theory?
The FBI began investigating Tiffany Henyard's business dealings just 6 months after she took over as supervisor of Thornton Township. Federal authorities had already requested all records related to her political fund, charity foundation, and township operations, signaling that her financial activities were under intense scrutiny. As the investigation into her alleged corruption deepened, more people came forward to expose her actions, something Tiffany should have anticipated. Given the controversy that surrounded her administration from the outset. From the beginning, Tiffany was a target of growing criticism, particularly from members of her own dream team. This group was handpicked by Tiffany herself to help manage the township. What should have been a unified force quickly devolved into a nightmare for her, as those she had trusted most began questioning her leadership and exposing her questionable actions. Trustees Tiana Beller and Jason House, along with village clerk Allison Key, were initially her closest allies. However, they quickly became some of her most outspoken critics, refusing to ignore the unethical and questionable decisions she was making. Tensions mounted, and the trustees who were chosen for their perceived loyalty to Tiffany began working with the village board to take legal action against her. They accused Tiffany of serious conflicts of interest, particularly as evidence grew that she was using her position to further her personal financial interests rather than serving the people of Dalton. This controversy emerged only 6 months into her term, revealing deep divisions within her administration and fueling growing opposition against her. Instead of taking responsibility or addressing the trustees' concerns, Tiffany retaliated in a desperate bid to regain control. She accused them of intentionally causing controversy and working against her vision to make Dalton great. By portraying herself as a victim of a political witch hunt, Tiffany further distanced herself from her former allies. She refused to admit any wrongdoing, and her aggressive response only widened the gap between her and the very people who had once supported her. However, the federal investigation into her business dealings made it increasingly difficult for Tiffany to maintain the facade of legitimacy that she had carefully constructed. The FBI expanded their inquiry to every aspect of her political fund and charity foundation, raising even more questions about how public funds were being managed under her leadership. What had initially been whispers of corruption quickly turned into a storm of allegations as more people came forward to reveal the truth about her administration. The turning point came when Tiffany's most ardent supporters, realizing the potential legal ramifications of staying associated with her, began publicly distancing themselves from her. Once seen as untouchable, Tiffany was now witnessing her empire crumble before her eyes. Every attempt to silence her critics only backfired, further solidifying the belief that she was more concerned with protecting herself than with serving the people of Dalton. As the legal battles intensified, Tiffany's administration was increasingly viewed as riddled with conflicts of interest. A lawsuit brought by the trustees against Tiffany made it clear that her leadership was tainted by corruption. The more the investigation progressed, the more it became evident that Tiffany's leadership had been built on a foundation of self-interest, with no regard for the town or its residents. What had begun as an unstoppable rise to power was now a steady and inevitable decline, driven by Tiffany's own actions and the unwillingness of those around her to continue supporting her attempts to retaliate against those who opposed her, along with her self-serving decisions and refusal to accept responsibility, only hastened her downfall. The investigation was uncovering more about her unethical practices, and former allies were now cooperating with federal authorities, determined to hold her accountable. With each new revelation, Tiffany's political career seemed closer to its inevitable end. Many questioned whether the scrutiny was going too far, but the reality was undeniable. Tiffany's leadership had been failing Dalton in nearly every way. During her time in office, the town faced critical issues, such as crumbling roads, abandoned homes, and a police force desperate for resources. Yet Tiffany continued to squander public funds on unnecessary expenditures instead of addressing these pressing problems. Before she became mayor, Tiffany's tactics had already become more authoritarian. She began excluding trustees from their offices, attempting to intimidate those who might challenge her. Dalton had once been a town that valued community cohesion and acting in the best interests of its residents, but under Tiffany's governance, those values were being undermined by her increasingly self-serving actions. Perhaps one of the most egregious examples of Tiffany's disregard for the public was her lavish spending, which included using taxpayer dollars for extravagant billboards featuring her own face. Additionally, she spent taxpayer money on first-class flights and luxurious accommodations at upscale hotels, expenses that seemed to serve her personal agenda rather than the needs of the community she was supposed to serve as federal investigators closed in. It became clearer that Tiffany's political rise had been built on a series of corrupt practices, and that her fall from power was not just inevitable, it was already underway. Her inability to accept responsibility, combined with her increasingly desperate efforts to cling to power, only made it more difficult for her to avoid the consequences of her actions. Those who had once stood by her were now contributing to the investigation that would ultimately dismantle her political empire in the end. Tiffany Henyard's story serves as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the inevitable collapse of those who believe they are beyond accountability. Her once unshakable reign has been shattered, and the truth behind her corruption is finally coming to light, with federal authorities closing in and former allies working against her. It is clear that her political career is coming to a swift and undeniable conclusion. Tiffany Henyard's tenure as a political leader quickly descended into scandal as her self-serving actions took center stage, overshadowing her once promising political career. Her extravagant lifestyle, manipulative tactics, and disregard for the welfare of Dalton's residents became increasingly evident, fueling the growing opposition against her leadership. One of the clearest indicators of her misplaced priorities was her use of taxpayer dollars for personal gain, a theme that would come to define her leadership style throughout her time in office. Tiffany spared no expense in crafting a larger-than-life image for herself. She employed high-profile DJs, professional photographers, and even hired a full security team to ensure her personal safety. These expenditures clearly demonstrated that Tiffany was more interested in enhancing her personal status than fulfilling her role as a public servant. Her leadership became more about building her personal brand and less about serving the community. She was elected to lead. Her fixation on self-promotion was so extreme that she went to great lengths to ensure that anything not directly benefiting her image was either canceled or sabotaged. One of the most striking instances of this occurred when Tiffany blocked the use of a public park for a local event. The gathering, organized by local resident Bosley, had been an annual tradition, but Tiffany had scheduled her own competing event just a few miles away. Rather than allow the community event to proceed as planned, she ordered massive cement blocks to be placed at the park entrance, effectively preventing the gathering from taking place. This was a clear display of her willingness to undermine anything that didn't directly serve her self-interest. Her tactics became even more egregious when she deliberately disrupted other community events, further illustrating her egocentric leadership. Tiffany had promised Dalton improvement and progress during her campaign, but as time passed, it became apparent that her true priorities lay in maintaining her personal image and power. Trustees within the township began to realize that Tiffany's leadership was becoming a liability to the community. Her actions were no longer focused on addressing the issues facing Dalton, such as crumbling roads, abandoned homes, and underfunded services, but on preserving her status. They realized that they had to take action to curb her influence, ultimately seeking ways to remove her from office. One of the most infamous examples of Tiffany's self-serving behavior occurred when she shut down the annual car show in the parking lot of Neopark, a beloved community event. Bosley, the event organizer, had paid $1,000 to the park district for the necessary permit and had made all the arrangements for the event. However, on the Saturday morning of the event, he arrived at the park to find concrete barricades blocking the entrance and Dalton police officers threatening to tow any cars that tried to park there. It became clear to everyone involved that Tiffany was determined to ensure that no event could overshadow her own self-promotional spectacle. Tiffany's assistant informed Bosley that the event would be shut down, but suggested that he could hold it at Tiffany's event location on Greenwood without any issues. This was just one of many examples of how Tiffany used her political power to manipulate situations for her own benefit. The car show, a cherished local tradition, had been replaced by yet another spectacle designed to enhance Tiffany's public image. As time went on, Tiffany's reputation continued to erode, and more insiders came forward with information about her misconduct. Carmen Carroll, a former insider, exposed the lengths Tiffany had gone to manipulate her staff, vendors, and residents in order to consolidate power and maintain an iron grip on the township. According to Carroll, Tiffany had been systematically using these tactics over the past 2 years, all while manipulating public perception to present herself as a successful and effective leader despite growing allegations and a widening federal investigation into her actions. Tiffany refused to accept responsibility for her conduct. Instead, she attempted to shift the blame onto her right-hand man, Keith Freeman, arguing that he should bear the brunt of the responsibility for the corruption, financial mismanagement, and abuse of power within her administration. This blame-shifting tactic appeared to be a last-ditch effort to salvage her career and protect herself from the mounting pressure. But even as Tiffany tried to deflect attention from her own actions, Keith Freeman found himself embroiled in a legal battle of his own. He was charged with fraud in a separate FBI investigation, further confirming the pervasive corruption within Tiffany's administration. As more insiders came forward with damning information about Tiffany's behavior, it became increasingly clear that her political empire had been built on deceit and manipulation. Public frustration grew as it became apparent that the trust Tiffany had demanded from her staff and the loyalty she had expected from her allies were quickly disintegrating. The very people who had once supported Tiffany were now either turning against her or falling with her. The irony of Tiffany trying to place the blame on Freeman while he was dealing with his own legal issues was not lost on the public. It was only a matter of time before Tiffany faced the consequences of her actions. Tiffany had spent years building her political career through manipulation, intimidation, and reckless spending. She had carefully crafted an image of success, one that presented her as a polished and effective leader. But behind this image, her success was built on the backs of hard-working taxpayers from Thornton Township and the village of Dalton. As investigators delved deeper into her administration, they began to uncover the true extent of her corruption. An administration marked by fraud, financial mismanagement, and the abuse of public funds in an attempt to protect Tiffany. Her criminal defense attorney, Brinley Bowe, argued that Tiffany had been unaware of the impropriety of using taxpayer money for personal expenses such as first-class travel and lavish accommodations. According to Bowe, Tiffany had trusted Freeman's assurances that such expenses were reasonable and justified. Yet, it became increasingly clear that Tiffany was not as ignorant as she pretended. She had made calculated decisions to use public funds for personal gain, all while presenting herself as a champion of Dalton's future. Despite the overwhelming evidence of corruption and mismanagement, Tiffany still maintained a devoted following. Some Dalton residents continued to support her, arguing that she had made politics more approachable and entertaining. Tiffany's ability to manipulate the narrative through social media played a significant role in maintaining her celebrity-like status. Every post she shared online gained traction, helping her cultivate a loyal fan base that viewed her as a figure to be admired rather than scrutinized. However, as more revelations about her administration came to light, the mounting criticism became impossible to ignore. Calls for accountability grew louder, especially in response to allegations of fraud and the misappropriation of public funds. People wanted Tiffany held accountable for her actions, and many questioned how she had been allowed to operate with such impunity for so long. The ongoing investigation into Tiffany's conduct sparked growing frustration among residents, who felt that the longer she remained in power, the more urgent it became for her to face justice. Despite her efforts to maintain her carefully crafted public image, the truth about her leadership was becoming undeniable. The people of Dalton wanted answers, and they demanded that Tiffany be held accountable for the alleged crimes she had committed during her time in office. The debate over whether Tiffany should remain in office or be removed became heated, with opinions divided across the community. Her use of taxpayer money for personal gain, coupled with growing allegations of fraud, fueled the argument for her removal. In contrast, her supporters continued to view her as a misunderstood leader, one who had made politics more engaging and accessible. However, the majority of the public recognized a troubling pattern of behavior that had defined Tiffany's leadership, a pattern marked by scandal, self-promotion, and a disregard for the well-being of the residents. She was supposed to serve regardless of the stance taken on the matter. Tiffany's case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked political power. It highlighted the importance of holding elected officials accountable for their actions and the necessity of maintaining political integrity. If Tiffany was allowed to escape the consequences of her alleged misdeeds simply because of her popularity or social media influence, it would set a dangerous precedent for future politicians who might attempt to follow in her footsteps. The continued public outrage underscored the urgency of the situation, as residents demanded justice not only for Tiffany's alleged crimes, but also for the broader systemic issues that had allowed her to rise to power in the first place. Tiffany's case served as a stark reminder that no elected official should be above scrutiny, and that the integrity of the political system could only be maintained by holding those in power accountable for their actions. Whether Tiffany would be held accountable or continue to manipulate the system remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the people of Dalton deserved better, and the call for accountability was critical for the future of political integrity.